So yeah, let's get started. Let me pop this on. Okay, cool. So just introducing myself. My name is Janelle Barajas. I am a member of Gabriella Portland, but in a larger scope, I'm also the regional coordinator for Bayan Portland. Bayan is a national grassroots alliance of progressive people organizations and overseas compatriot or like Filipino organizations. And then what we unite on is that we struggle for genuine democracy and national sovereignty in the Philippines. And we are the main campaign center for the national democratic movement with the socialist perspective of the Philippines. If that is like a new thing to you, that's okay. Basically, we are like a progressive movement and we are like pro people. We are fighting for national democracy in the Philippines, or national sovereignty of the Philippines and genuine democracy of the Philippines. And something to know about our organizations like Gabriella and Bayan, Anak Bayan and Migrante, is that we're not solidarity organizations. So we're not like in solidarity with the Philippines. We are part of the national democratic movement. And so when you hear things like somebody in Gabriella was killed in the Philippines for being a progressive activist, like that's actually our organization. And so our own people are being targeted by the government in the Philippines, abroad, including the US. And we are part and parcel of like a larger internationalist movement. And we're just educators. Like we love to educate people. We love to learn from people. We love to give political education like this. And we want to take everybody along with us because we know that a blow to imperialism anywhere like the Philippines slows and starts killing the machine in other places. And so that is like why we do solidarity work and why we're excited to work with DSA in the future. So yeah, oh, this is just some of us in Portland here. We have the Migrante flag, the Gabriella flag, the Anak Bayan flag.
Oh yeah, we also, I guess there's also the, like PCHIRP is part of like the solidarity side of things, which is saying like, yeah, we're organizations outside of the Philippines and we're in solidarity. And so this is a alliance called the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, and I'm also part of that, as well as being part of DSA. So
cool. Yeah.
Cool.
So if you like this kind of work and some of the things that we're going to be talking about, you definitely can get involved if you're Filipino with the Bayan organization, or if you're not, through iChirp US is another great way to get involved. We work really closely together, so we're hanging out all the time. But yeah, let's hop into the cool. So we have a couple of objectives for this this political education discussion. The first one is we want to understand what neoliberalism is and how it affects the most oppressed people today. So a lot of the examples that we're going to be using is from the Philippines because that's kind of our gig. And I think that we have a lot of good examples of how neoliberalism manifests in a developing country like the Philippines. Number two, we want to learn about the three basic tenets of neoliberalism, and we want to connect it to policies and burning issues today. As we know, the most burningest issue that's affecting a lot of us is the COVID-19 things. I myself am an out of work service industry person. So now I'm just doing my community organizing pretty much full time. And I know that I have like an ex-coworker on here too. So shout out to my friend there. And then number three, we want to discuss the solutions and ongoing campaigns to resist neoliberalism. So again, we're going to be talking about things about the Philippines, but hopefully for organizers on here, you guys can take that, either like join us in those campaigns or kind of like look at your own issues maybe through this lens. And maybe this will help raise the analysis and the practice. So hopefully some of this stuff helps. All right, so here's kind of like the structure that we're going to go through today. We're going to talk about neoliberalism. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of neoliberalism. We're going to give you the three tenets of neoliberalism, some of the impacts today. We can talk about stuff at the end, and then a little bit more about calls to action at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to hand this off to Comrade Alex to take us through the first couple of points, and then I'll hop in if I have stuff. But yeah, let's take it away.
Yeah, so on this slide, you have people protesting, I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it's a trade treaty or trade alliance in Asia, Asia Pacific Economic Community. Anyway, so like through this presentation, we'll see like why are people protesting like an economic treaty, right? And what is like what are economic treaties like this doing right now? What is neoliberalism? I wanted to actually open it up now and see what like different people's ideas around neoliberalism is, because here is a definition as an approach to economics and social studies in which control of economic factors is given from the public sector to the private sector. So this is just one definition, and I wanted to like open the floor so that other people could say like if they have like initial ideas about neoliberalism.
Wait. I guess just I'll chime in if no one's
Okay,
chiming in,
okay.
because I would say I have like kind of a very not a great understanding of it, because honestly, and just kind of as a privileged person, it's really only been in my ear for the last couple of years, as something that is sort of just like a blasé centrist approach to keeping a status quo. I don't really know. I don't really think about it that often, but I just wanted to put like kind of maybe a more ignorant starting place down for you to maybe go from. I don't know if that helps or whatever.
I think it does help. I think you're raising like a big important point, which is that neoliberalism is like, it's like the status quo right now. To keep doing neoliberalism is like a very like in the middle idea. Yeah.
Yeah, that is my understanding. Yeah.
Does anybody else have a comment or addition?
That's pretty much exactly the understanding that I've always had of it too.
Yeah, I mean, hi, this is Angelica from Portland. I think too the idea of like liberalism in we're in a really interesting time where liberal and liberalism kind of get conflated. And if we don't talk about it in the economic context, then all of a sudden everyone's like, I'm a liberal, right? And we're not actually talking about what the core of that economic understanding is. And I think of laissez-faire. And then I think of like this whole fucking philosophy, like this philosophy that's like new laissez-faire, hands-off government. But then to the slide on just the previous slide, this is me showing the previous slide. I think it's neoliberal policies that benefit the 1%, right? Economic policies that actually do not serve the people, but because of the kind of convoluted way that we talk about the free market, it's couched in an idea that like it is for the people, when in actuality it is not at all, because the government is not for the people, so then the economy is also not for the people.
All right, awesome. Yeah, I think those are all great points, and we'll get into it. So in Bayan, they talk about imperialism in relation to imperialism and capitalism. So so neoliberalism is not like going against imperialism or like something beyond imperialism, but it's actually like a form of imperialism or like a style or a tool of imperialism. And so in its response to the crisis of overproduction or capitalist crisis, so that as Marx talked about, like under capitalism, companies need to produce more and more all the time, but there's not enough workers with enough money to buy all the things that capitalists want to make profits producing. So eventually they overproduce so much that the economy crashes. And in response, neoliberalism is one of the reactionary responses to this. So they want to still keep getting profits, and then also even beyond like ordinary profits, super profits from exploiting the third world even more on top of that, even during crises. So so neoliberal, neo means new, and liberal comes from like the free of government intervention. So so like the original Adam Smith kind of idea of liberalism was that you just had to keep the government, which at that time was mostly like feudal even, or a monarchy, keep that out of the economy, and then businesses will do all of these things. And then so today it's recycling those ideas about like freedom for businesses in an era that looks completely different. And then we have this comic, which I'm sure everyone has read by now. But it's saying that there's no way to balance the budget except for attacking social spending. So we're gonna see if this video works and the sound works, because I think it does a good job.
In this iteration of 3-Minute Theory, we bring you a concept that you might not know by name, but have surely felt by its far-reaching effects: neoliberalism. Simply, neoliberalism is the idea that society should be shaped by the free market, and that the economy should be deregulated and privatized. Or even simpler, what works in the private sector will also work in the public sector. But it doesn't stop there. Neoliberalism also involves the idea that the public sector should not only follow the private sector's rules, but it should also subsidize the private sector, which we know is now owned by fewer and fewer global capitalists. While neoliberalism began to reach its current heights in the late 1970s, it has its roots in Enlightenment liberal humanism, or classical liberalism, the belief that people were free to live their lives without a great deal of interference from the government. So what does neoliberalism have to do with classical liberalism, and why does it matter? Well, neoliberalism isn't really new itself, but is a new take on classical liberalism. Neoliberalism uses the language and tenets of classical liberalism in ways that now benefit large corporate interests. For example, many of the tenets of liberalism were enacted in the name of equality, meaning that free market policies were supposed to allow people an equal chance into the marketplace. Under neoliberalism, however, the free market loses its ties to democratic ideals and instead allows corporate capitalists to open up previously unavailable markets. Basically, the free market becomes increasingly free for wealthy corporate capitalists and less free for everyone else. Although neoliberalism is a discourse that we cannot necessarily see, it has real material effects on many aspects of our lives. Let's take the American public education system as an example of how business interests have infiltrated public systems. In the past, public schools were set up to offer a free education to promote the liberal humanist ideas of liberty and equality. But with the rise of neoliberalism and in turn education reform movements, the lines between public and private education have been blurred. What we now see is heavy private investment from private individuals and corporations. In the name of liberty, neoliberals use the business-laden language of choice, free market, and deregulation to dismantle and then reconstruct public schools in a corporate image. This all happens through the use of language that sounds lovely and freeing, but ultimately doesn't prompt too many questions from the general public. As corporations take a stronghold in the public sector, we also see the reciprocal investment of public school dollars into private companies. Not familiar with the education system? That's okay. You don't have to look far to see neoliberalism at work. Remember, neoliberalism is everywhere, and it isn't limited to one political party. It's both right and left, and conservative and liberal, which makes it very hard to work against. So next time you hear a politician or CEO talking about the greater good, take a moment to wonder who's good. More often than not, the good being held up as liberty for all might really just be more money for some.
So this video is, I think it's a good video for just covering like major aspects of it. I don't think anything is perfect. So we'll go into the some of the more details about the relationship between neoliberalism and imperialism and neoliberalism and capitalism. So capitalist competition, and as capitalists get more and more machines to produce, that leads to the crisis of overproduction when they've produced too much too fast. And then so we see these happening like regularly even. So in like bubbles, like for instance, like the dot-com bubble of the early 2000s, or the one that's like maybe crashing around us right now. Yeah, and so because these crises are happening regularly, because there's no planned production under capitalism, what do capitalists want? So they are blaming increasing wages and social spending for the crisis. And in response, they're pushing for more and more power and influence for themselves. And so the goal of the biggest capitalists, especially, is to increase profit even in the face of a crisis. And as Lars said earlier, there was the Great Depression, which was a really bad crisis of capitalism. And then in response to this emerged like Keynesianism, which is the belief that like government spending could prop up the economy. And then the economy pulled out of that because of the war economy, which destroyed, entire countries' ability to produce, which then led to the imperialist ability to invest in those countries. And so if you were able to sell things and invest money in Germany and Japan, suddenly you didn't have so much of a crisis of overproduction. So that's what we saw after World War II. And then along with that, in the big imperialist countries, we saw increase of social spending and sort of more of a social democratic aspect. So, and that happened because of the people struggling. It didn't happen for free. So there were all these social movements that were building up, all of these strikes that were building up through the 1950s and 60s. But those movements were sort of defeated, actually. So by the 1970s, by the end of the 1970s, you had the weakness of the left. You had the weakness of national liberation movements in socialist countries. So that that was the beginning of like an offensive of the 1% and the beginning of neoliberalism. Yeah. So in the Philippines, they have an expression for neoliberalism, lapida, which means tombstone. And then la is liberalization, p is privatization, and da is deregulation. So those things going together are what is making up neoliberalism.
Yeah, us Filipinos like acronyms.
So we'll define those things. So liberalism is the opening of trade and the import and export of goods and people without limits from the state. So it is total movement of people, total freedom of movement for capital, goods, and people, but especially for capital and goods. So an example of that is like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was recently canceled. Another example would be NAFTA. That's maybe the most familiar one in the US because the North American Free Trade Agreement made it so that it was like possible for American businesses that produced corn using extreme technology and fertilizers and even US government support to sell their corn in Mexico. And a Mexican peasant farmer can't compete with that. So it led to just a crisis in rural Mexico, and in turn, people trying to migrate for a better life. And so this kind of thing where like the idea of free trade is used to, and efficiency is used to actually like destroy societies is a big aspect of liberalization.
Yeah, and then I'll just add an example. I went to the Philippines last year. The Bayan organizations go to the Philippines on exposure trips a couple of times a year. I went last summer, and there was a peasant farmer in the Cordilleras, which is like way up north, like really high altitudes. That's like the place when you see the pictures of like the rice terraces, like the big mountains that are just like full of like rice terraces. I was like in that area, and there's a peasant farmer who for all these generations, like they lived like fairly peacefully. I mean, there's like all kinds of things that is like hard about being a peasant. But one positive thing is that they had a rice paddy where they could harvest like their own rice, and they could participate in the local economy in the Cordilleras, and basically sell like their rice inside of like their own local economy. But now they have like all these grandkids, and like they're all basically training to like enter the cash economy outside of the countryside in the cities. And the cities already have a glut of people coming from the countryside who are no longer able to participate in the local economy, because cheap rice that's actually produced in the Philippines, exported and processed in another country, is being sold back into the Philippines, and is so cheap because of like all of these free trade agreements, and we'll talk about some of the ones in just a bit, that the like even producing their own rice isn't even like a viable option for them anymore. And so although they like have like lots of ways to like sustain themselves as people, like they can't, like it's not even worth growing your own rice anymore. Like it's cheaper just to like buy it, and they couldn't even like pay people to help them. They're like old, like they're like super old people, but they can't even pay like people to help them harvest the rice, because like they don't even make enough money to like compete with like, you know, all of the people who are going to the cities and working in call centers, this and that. So that's just like an example from the Philippines about how like free trade affects like old local economies.
So privatization is the private control of resources that would otherwise be public and socialized that should be accessible to all, such as water, electricity, education, and healthcare. So it looks like here's a protest of people protesting the privatization of public hospitals in the Philippines. One example that's familiar to us close at home in Portland is the privatization of schools through charter schools, where people are saying that public schools are backwards. So instead of making public schools better, we should just create a system where anybody can start a company and brand themselves as a school and start getting public money to teach any way they want and make a profit while doing it. Next slide.
And then, oh yeah, just like to add, just from like the Bayan perspective, like, and we'll use the Philippines again as like the example, but this is happening in a lot of like developing nations as well. Like with the COVID-19 global pandemic that's happening, like although viruses like are, I mean, they're technically like a natural biological like event that happens on Earth. Like it's not necessarily something that's like totally out of like the realm of possibilities that can happen in this world. But the problem is that like the rapid spread and subsequent response, and that's reflective of state policy and corporate practices. So like in the Philippines, for example, like the Philippines is an extremely poor country. It's rich in natural resources, like there's no doubt about that. But the people are extremely poor. And then so with like neoliberal policies that have been like enacted upon the Philippines over the last couple of years, we see like the big pharma that's like the couple of companies that have been buying smaller companies and like creating these like pharma monopolies. They're able to like set these prices so high that like, I mean, like we can't even buy, like us people in Portland like can't afford healthcare, like, and like so think about people in third world countries that live in abject poverty and for the most part are destitute, having to pay like these astronomical prices that are set by these giant monopoly corporations. And so although the Philippines does have national healthcare, elements of it are being privatized, and the healthcare is just like, it's plainly, in plain words, like it's very bad. People who are richer have a little bit more access to it, but the poorest people that have like very little or no access to healthcare whatsoever. So, but yeah, and that's like all contributing to the spread of this virus too, is like people aren't able to get personal protective equipment and people aren't able to get tested, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but yeah.
Yeah. I think one example of privatization in health is also like how companies are seeing something like hospital beds as like a place to do cost cutting. So in the Philippines, in line with the privatization of health, between the 90s and 2010s, they went from like 15 beds per thousand to 10 beds per thousand. So it's well under what the government, it's well under what is recommended, but because they're able to see like health as like a cost, a place to make profit or lose money rather than a public good, it shows the neoliberal way of thinking.
I think I was also going to say that if we want to talk about privatization of healthcare, we can see it as a stark example in comparison to the Philippines here in the United States, even with the availability of testing, who's being able to get tested under COVID-19, who has insurance, right? So I love this educational discussion because it talks about the current conditions of what what in the West sometimes we deem as a third world country, but really the Philippines, and I know the facilitators will talk about this later. It's like a very strong country in people's movement, but still experiences privatization. But we're no different. We're no different in the fact that even though we live in a capitalist country, health insurance is so privatized in a way that now we can't even. We're not even able. The privatization of our healthcare system is enabling us in this country to actually get the proper testing that's needed to do any kind of facilitation to control a virus that is spreading rapidly, So yeah, I just like to see that it is not actually very different, it's different in the manifestation, and under the different conditions, but yeah, it's similar too.
Yeah, and then finally is deregulation, which is removing or reducing state regulations in the economy. I think when I think of deregulation right now, I'm thinking of how companies are losing money right now and then turning to the government and saying, this is why you should allow us to work our workers harder in the case of trucking companies, or you should allow us to not pay a tax in the case of like airline companies, or you should allow us to pollute more in the case of oil companies. So this is anytime there's a crisis, the neoliberal attempt to keep profits up during the crisis is to push for more and more deregulation, and the narrative that any kind of regulation is hurting the economy. Yeah, so a good example from the US is the BP oil spill. I have a friend who is from somewhere in here between Mobile and Biloxi. And when the oil spill happened, due to the company's carelessness and lack of strict regulation, it put so many fishermen out of business. And so these were small business owners even, but even as the area sort of began to recover, the small fishing companies did not come back. And their market share was captured by the biggest fishing companies and shrimp companies. So neoliberalism is an attack not just on workers, but it's also attack by the biggest part of the bourgeoisie on other businesses that have less power. And then you can see that has an international dimension, as it's an attack on capitalist countries and capitalists that are smaller and in opposition to the very biggest companies. This slide is talking about worsening working conditions as an aspect of neoliberalism. So there was a fire in the Philippines where workers were killed because the company was careless. And this isn't to say that there were more regulations before neoliberalism, or that it was good before neoliberalism, but just that neoliberalism is taking away regulations and preventing attempts to add regulations and add protections. I think
Cool.
another.
Go ahead, Sika.
Oh, I wanted to give one more example, which in the U.S. I'm unemployed right now also, and I have like part-time jobs. I had like 2 part-time jobs, and I'm laid off from both of them. But an example of neoliberalism is how companies will hire workers and then keep them at like 25 hours or less, so that at no point do they have to treat anybody as a full-time worker with benefits. Because if they can say that you're a part-time worker, they can say that, well, you have a freedom to do something else with the rest of your time. So we're not going to give you the benefits that go with a full-time job at all.
Does anyone have any questions before we move on kind of to like the second part of the presentation? Or any comments, thoughts? Cool. Okay, so that kind of brings us to basically like the main thrust or goal of neoliberalism and neoliberalist tactics. And that's what we call, and this is like the word that we use for it in Bayan. Some people might have another word for it, but we say denationalization. So in like, for example, for the Philippines, we are what we refer to as a semi-colony of the U.S. So while we are not officially on paper a colony of the U.S., we, in all intents and purposes, are treated and are used like a colony to the U.S. And the manifestation of that is that assets of the Philippines are owned and operated by a country, in this case the U.S., and made available to foreign or private companies. And so a good example of this is, and this is from the same trip that I took in the summertime, we went on what's called the Filipinos call it an ocular inspection of this mining, well, it used to be an indigenous person's community and ancestral land of the Lumad people. The word Lumad is interchangeable with like indigenous, I guess. But these are ancestral lands of the Lumad people. And this top like panoramic picture is showing what used to be a white sand beach and like mountains. And you can see now that it's essentially an open pit mine. What happened here is that a multinational corporation, and in this particular example, this was an Australian corporation. A multinational corporation said, I think that we would like to see if there's any nickel in these mountains. And the government said, okay, you can go ahead and look. The way that they look is that they open up an open pit mine and actually like start their operations. And because the earth doesn't just say like, I'm just gonna put nickel here on this mountainside, the earth is just like doing what it does, and it's like has nickel, has copper, has gold, has silver, has all of these natural minerals that are in this land, these ancestral domain. The company, because they said we're going to look for nickel, they only have to pay the Philippine government for nickel. Everything else is totally free to them. When they dig things up and there's like copper in there, well, they just got free copper. They just got free silver. They just got free gold. And they're just paying for the nickel. And over on the left, you can see that there's a couple barges. If we were to move that tree, we would see that there's like 20, 30 more out there. And what they're doing is they're like dredging. They're like taking like the dirt from the earth and like dumping it in the ocean. And they're also like hauling out natural materials to go back to either be processed in another country or in Australia in this case. And the people who live there get none of that money. In fact, they are, live totally impoverished. A lot of them die because of health and respiratory diseases that they get from this. But the point is that because the point of neoliberalism is to take resources from other countries and basically like denationalize those resources. Alex, do you have anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I do. Because it's taking away from the earth and from society, and that's what denationalization is encompassing. So in the case of mining in the Philippines, the constitution that was written in 1986 after the People Power Revolution had restrictions on foreign ownership of property. So, but then in 1995, they passed a law saying that mining companies could be 100% foreign owned. So that was a big step in enabling this kind of resource extraction where none of the profits are going to the local community, and really it's just like bribes being paid to government officials, and all the profits are going to Australia and to Wall Street.
And we have to be sharp too, because like during this like global pandemic that all of us are experiencing right now, in the House, in the Philippine like House, a bill was passed, Bill number 78, where 100% Philippine businesses and utilities can be foreign owned. So at one point it was like some percentage can be foreign owned of like water, electricity, healthcare, things like that. While everybody was like trying to figure out like what we were going to do about COVID-19, this bill like squeaked past. And now like natural resources and national resources and utilities can be owned by foreign investors. So like the US. And so the manifestations of that, I mean, I think that we can just say are going to be grave for the people of the Philippines, and will not benefit people like us in the US at all. Rather, it will benefit, the people who are part of the ruling class on Wall Street, and the big bourgeoisie.
Spirit.
Yeah, I think this is talking more about a trade agreement that did not get passed because of disagreements between Trump and China. But these kinds of trade agreements are that like NAFTA are continuing to be pushed, that will open up countries to having their populations put to work in they call them like special economic zones, where there are no protections, like no protections on workers even compared to other areas. And in some cases you even have the military and the police deployed to prevent workers from forming unions. And so that kind of situation where in the rural area there's a crisis because of the dumping of foreign agricultural products, and then that leads to there being so many like almost refugees from the rural areas or migrants from the rural areas being put to work making industrial products for like America and rich countries.
Cool. I also just want to pause here for questions, just in case there was some on the denationalization tip. Cool. So now we're going to talk about how some ways that the neoliberal agenda is advanced. So on the right, and I just put this in here because it's cool. This is some Filipinos from Bayan organizations burning an effigy of a bald eagle in response to the Asian Pacific Economic Community like agreement, the free trade agreement between some Asian countries and then some like world powers like Australia and the US. So you could watch that as I talk. But basically the logos on the right is, you've probably seen these, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the WTO, the World Trade Organization. These are basically machineries in which the neoliberal agenda is pushed. So we'll use the World Bank and the IMF as an example. So back in 1944, the US like set up the World Bank and the IMF, and their purpose was basically to create an international order to make countries dependent on the United States and to make sure that no one could dictate US policy. And basically that was through putting other countries into debt. So the World Bank makes loans for what they call international development. But development is kind of like a euphemism for dependency on US exports and finance. And the dependency also entailed agricultural backwardness. And so like the World Bank would, and still does, oppose like land reforms, family farming to produce domestic food on crops, and monetary backwardness in basing their monetary system on the US dollar. So pegging other currencies to the US dollar, making it nearly impossible for countries like the Philippines, for example, to pay back these massive loans that are given. And a lot of the time too is like they will put countries into austerity, under austerity sanctions, where they'll say like, we're going to give you this loan, but we want to see what you're going to do with it. And a lot of the time that leads to like them dictating like an order where like it's like not a pro people way to spend that money. And so they can advance their own agendas because they give out these loans, and therefore they're able to keep people like in abject poverty, like with these loans, or in these countries. But yeah, so basically like the IMF and the World Bank make other countries borrow like in dollars and not their own currencies. And like, even though like sometimes like people are like, the World Bank is like so good and the IMF is so good, like they help like countries with like infrastructure and things like that. It's basically like an extension of colonialism or imperialism, right? Like these institutions are able to enact like imperialist modes of like control because they're keeping countries in poverty through these massive debts. Yeah. Do you have anything to add here, Alex?
No, I think you covered it.
Cool. So
can I add something, Janelle?
Yeah. Hey, Ozzy.
Hi. I was just gonna add that the IMF just recently denied Venezuela a loan because like obviously Venezuela has been sanctioned by the US and by a lot of other countries. And so they went to the IMF to seek help for the COVID-19 outbreak, and the IMF was like, nah. So that's it kind of shows you how much like of an instrument of imperialism, and specifically like US imperialism it is.
Thank you, that's a really good example. Cool. Can I just say that I really want to burn an effigy in Portland at some point and run around a flag with it. Just telling you what I'm thinking. Okay, cool. Does anyone have any questions about the neoliberal agenda before we move on? Or anything to add? Izzy, that was a great addition if anybody else has examples. Cool. So this kind of brings us to the point of like, all right, now what do we do, or what do we, oh, it looks like we have some stuff in the chat. Oh, Alexa says, let's burn a big ass effigy when I'm not in Colombia. Okay, thank you. But wait yeah, okay. Okay. So this kind of brings us to the point of like, all right, like now what sort of do we do, or what do we like wish for, or what can be some of our aspirations as the people that are affected by neoliberalism. And again, since we're going to talk about like what do the Filipino people want and what will combat this neoliberal agenda. So these are like some general calls from BayanPNW USA, the National Alliance, like stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership and all the neoliberal policies, stop the privatization of schools, water, and healthcare, uphold human rights and workers' rights, like we were talking about, the deregulation policies that make workplaces more dangerous to work in, respect Indigenous people's rights to ancestral land and education, and uphold national sovereignty of the Philippines. But for this presentation, I wanted to show everybody what the demands are. This is from Bayan Philippines, so that's like the Philippine chapter of the Alliance. But basically, like these are the demands that the Filipino people have come up with to their government of the Philippines in response to the COVID-19 pandemic that we see right now. And so we don't have to read all of these, but I just wanted to show you that like the things that we're seeing from and these demands are pro-people demands, and they're demands that basically are saying to the government, like, listen, we just like want to be alive, and we don't really care about you guys being in debt or whatever it is. Like, we want adequate funds for free testing and treatment and containment of COVID-19. We want free and systematic mass testing. And with that, like, we want scientific testing, like they put this call, the Bayan Philippines put out the call for free and systematic mass testing. But what the nurses were saying was, like, if you test everybody, like, you're going to overwhelm the system. Like, the system can't hold something like that. So, like, try this other style of testing where you take a sample from like an urban poor community, and you take a sample of people, and then you use like math magic to say, like, okay, this is actually like the number that we can estimate is here. Because if there's no testing, then how can we know that the pandemic is over, is escalating? Like, we need to go about this scientifically. Provide hospitals with additional equipment. Build community-based sanitation facilities and quarantine centers. Because utilities are so privatized, like, a lot of the Philippines doesn't have access to water. Like, they're telling people in the Philippines, okay, just chill out and wash your hands, but water goes on and off all day and night in the Philippines, and most of the urban poor communities don't have access to water at all. And even if they had access to water, how are they going to buy the soap and be able to keep the hygiene that the government is like instructing them? Ensure support and protection for frontliners, doctors, workers, nurses, x-ray technicians, anybody who's directly involved in the anti-COVID-19 efforts. Improve systems and protocols to address COVID-19 down to the community level. So, like, providing the people of the Philippines correct, timely, and understandable public information about COVID-19 and how to avoid infection. Like, don't just leave this up to like a couple of memes, rumors on the street, little clips that they might hear from the radio. Provide the people with actual accurate information, and make it accessible for them as well. And then there's also like socioeconomic demands, like prohibiting layoffs and providing with assistance for affected workers. Like, even here in the US, like, wouldn't that be amazing if we had that? And we're like what we're touted as the most powerful country in the world, and like our unemployment rate just went up 5 billion% in the last week. Number 8 is like distributing emergency relief packs to the poor, like making sure that the poorest of people have just like the most basic needs for containing COVID-19. And then implementing a moratorium on payments and penalties of basic utilities and services. But yeah, so like there's like more stuff like here, like ensuring transportation for those who need it. But I think that these demands are like a good example of like what an anti-neoliberal response would be. It would be like pro-people, and it would be scientific, and it would be benefiting the masses of people instead of just like Jeff Bezos. But yeah, so that kind of brings us to the end of the presentation. We talked about a lot of things, and so I want to take a moment to kind of chill for a second, and if anybody has any questions, we can answer them now. About neoliberalism in general, any of the 3 tenets of neoliberalism, Bayan as an organization, or if you just want to like vent or whatever, like you can do that here too. But yeah, so we'll pause and then we'll close out in just a second after people have their final thoughts.
I was just going to add that like we're sort of seeing a crumbling of the neoliberal hegemony that has been ruling over us for the last 70 plus years. And that's why, this is an unprecedented crisis, but also an opportunity to essentially stave off an incursion by fascists to take over. Like, this is a huge opportunity for the left to coalesce and provide alternatives to neoliberalism and fascism.
This is Angelica from Gabriella, Portland. I think that point is really astute in that when we were on the call with I believe it was the chairperson of Bayan in the Philippines just yesterday, something that came up for us was under neoliberal policy, you'll continue to see the exploitation of even a virus. So what we're seeing now in the Philippines and even in the US with the facilitation of deploying National Guard to states that have either stay at home or shelter in place policies, you're starting to see cracks of fascism, if not a full-blown attempt of exploiting a virus that, to be clear, is now man-made, right? The lack of reaction from both Philippine and US governments has exacerbated these virus, has exacerbated COVID-19. You're starting to see it being responded with fascist attacks. So I think that that's like a really, really poignant thing to consider, is that under neoliberal policies, it makes way for even the fascist regime to really find ways to continue to militarize and criminalize people.
Yeah, and I think like this is also, I mean, I think that like the powers that be are like kind of scrambling to like make sure that there isn't like an upsurge in like a people power type movement globally. But one of the goals of neoliberalism is to eliminate the concept of public good and community, and then shift that from community into individual responsibility. But it actually feels like a little bit more hopeful, because I think people are having like more of like a, okay, this is like the entire world, like a little bit more of like a public good and community response. And maybe that's just like a forced hand because like this is everybody. But I think like, yeah, I think is it Lars? You were saying like this is our opportunity to provide, as organizers, provide alternative to what the neoliberal ideology has been giving us for, I mean, definitely as long as I've been alive, our entire lives.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and just want to say that like that is when you're making the political demands, what I like about the buy-in political demands is that they incorporate the demands that address and expose the political system of the 1%, as well as there's demands that allow you to demonstrate an alternative on the small scale and the local scale, like to set up community, community health. That's something you can start doing immediately, as well as you can use it as a demand to address the government. So it's like a combination of political demands and also like practical way of showing mutual aid and support at the grassroots.
And just one thing I wanted to add, this is Alexis's roommate, Shanti. Hello. I think especially what I think this crisis is like highlighting is something that is known really, especially in the global South, how capitalism, it's an economic system, but it's one that relies on violence to like prop itself up. And that's super evident, especially in the global South. But this crisis that we're starting to see in the global North, especially in the US, but also like in the UK and a bit in Canada, is that like capitalism will like resort to violence in order to protect itself. And that's starting to appear, especially now in the US. So starting to see kind of a fraction of what the global South has been experiencing.
Ooh, read George Jackson. He talks about capitalism and how it takes on different forms. George Jackson is good.
There's that.
Yeah, taking notes, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway, back on mute.
I want to hear from someone who hasn't spoken yet. I think we're wrapping up.
All right, maybe they haven't spoken because they cannot use the functionality of the Zoom. That's okay. Cool, so just to wrap up, that was our ED on what neoliberalism is. If you weren't familiar with the concept, I hope that like this has given you some language as you move forward through COVID-19 and beyond. And of course, I think it would be awesome if you guys could follow us on some of our social media stuff, because we really need to like create an international movement around the National Democratic, and we could definitely use your help. In return, Bayan organizers can help you with your things, and also maybe you can learn a thing or two from the Philippines, because we're always happy to share our tactics and to share the resources that we have. This has been, the National Democratic has been around for a really long time, and so we have like a lot of writings and a lot of analysis around all kinds of different concepts like neoliberalism. So this is kind of just the tip of the iceberg. And so we hope that if you follow us on social media, you come to our other webinars. A lot of our organizers are out of work right now, and so we're just like cranking away at all kinds of educational stuff. And then we hope to attend yours as well. So yeah, shout out to DSA. Thanks for hosting this political discussion. And we hope that we can do more with DSA in the coming months and weeks and years. But yeah, that's pretty much what we got. Yeah, I think that's the end. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.